We used to joke on a podcast I did, a hardware podcast, about how eventually somebody was going to figure out how to break into your home network via light bulbs. And that was a really funny long-standing joke, right up until the day we read the article about how somebody had figured out an unpatched thing in a fairly popular series of controllable light bulbs, and actually used it to get inside people's networks.
They do everything via Oz these days, so accounts have the same powers as their real-world users. Steal an account from the water department manager and the pipes are yours to control. Steal a JR employee's account and you can mess with the train schedules. There are over 1 billion registered users. Institutions around the world rely on Oz to get things done.
People put all their privileges online because they thought that it'd be safe.
On this episode of ResiWeek, we talk IoT security certifications, speaker placements, and Specifi licensing deals. All this and more on this episode of ResiWeek. This is ResiWeek, episode 424, Small Biz Proposals. Welcome to this episode of ResiWeek. This is your weekly roundup of all the latest news and stories for the residential AV industry. I'm your host, Matty Scott for AVNation.tv, and this week I'm pleased to be joined by two of my good friends. First, we have Mark Feinberg. He's the president of Home Theater Advisors. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Then we have Patrick Norton. He's a content specialist over at CTI. How you doing, Patrick?
I'm full of mirth and good cheer.
Mirth and good cheer.
It'll pass.
Hopefully. Oh, it's way more than me. All right. We are going to kick this off with a note of congratulations from Residential Systems. The CEO of CEDIA, Daryl Friedman, has been extended on a contract extension through 2027 with proven success in financial stability, industry advocacy, and increased member engagement. He's posed to lead the association into its next phase. So congratulations to Daryl on that. As we were talking in the pre-show, he's done a really good job taking over and doing great things with the association, and looking forward to seeing what he can do going forward. All right, let's switch over to a story that comes to us from CE Pro. The CSA announces a consolidated IoT device security certification. So this is, it's a mouthful, but this is in collaboration with, where is it now? The FCC's U.S. Cyber Trust Mark. Again, all with the goal of trying to make IoT devices a little bit more secure. Mark, let me start with you on this. Is the collaboration aspect of this, is that really the first step? Because obviously too many, verified marks means that they don't mean anything. So is kind of coming together really the first step in hopefully moving this forward?
Yeah, I mean, if you have all these different disparate marks, I guess is the best way to put it, right? Or certifications that everyone's got something different, then no one knows what anything means, especially in the consumer grade stuff. And everyone's kind of fighting with each other, going to blame somebody else for what happened. They're not going to interoperate well with the security. Yeah, kind of consolidating, I think, it makes a lot of sense, and hopefully will make it much more effective.
That's a great point. Patrick, when I read through the requirements, or at least a few of the listed requirements, these are no-brainers. But I also...
Yes, I agree.
I'm aware. I'm trying to not be super nitpicky. But these are... they're what we would expect these days. Is there a difference between what we would expect and what the consumer expects?
I've got two different ways of looking at this. One is a bunch of friends that work in computer security and are like pen testers, and they have a very sophisticated, elevated knowledge, and they're terrified. Just like when Wi-Fi came out, I had somebody talk to me. He's like, would you remind people, especially say vice presidents at banking firms in Lower Manhattan, that if they want wireless connectivity to their laptop, they should talk to their IT department, because I got a $6 million security budget that's been bypassed 3 times in the last 3 months because I have people who want wireless laptops and bring in a consumer grade router and don't put a password on it. I won't tell you whose business card I was holding at that time, or I should say the company, right? But it was like, and I thought that was funny. And I had a friend of mine go downtown with basically like a Wi-Fi sniffer,
Mhm.
and he found this, and this was early Wi-Fi days. He found like, I think he said 800 open Wi-Fi devices, many of which were
That sounds right.
connected to, you know, things that should not have been exposed, right? And I point that out because we used to joke on a podcast I did, a hardware podcast, about how eventually somebody was going to figure out how to break into your home network via light bulbs. And that was a really funny long-standing joke, right up until the day we read the article about how somebody had figured out an unpatched thing in a fairly popular series of controllable light bulbs, and actually used it to get inside people's networks. And it sounds ridiculous, but in the case, especially like Mark was mentioning, like the consumer space, there's a lot of stuff out there, even routers from high-profile companies that they are released, they get maybe one update, or
Mhm.
in the cases of a whole lot of inexpensive consumer grade stuff, think I'm shopping for whatever on Amazon, where they kind of put their logo on whatever control software there is, and never really do any due diligence or any serious security testing. If they do whatever's easiest, they do whatever's cheapest. They're in a commodity area. And so, yeah, I think all of this stuff, you have to set a baseline or it'll be ignored if it saves them money. And that's, as the stakes get higher and higher, I think this is smarter and smarter, especially for stuff. It's amazing how many routers are around, like wireless routers, that have never gotten a security update or gotten one or two.
Yeah,
And it could be because the software was flawless when it was released in the factory.
of
Um,
course.
Here in the group, I'm going to use feeling words because this is a safe space. I feel that that's
Yes.
probably not the case, right? Um, if it's somebody, hacking into your Wi-Fi or your home network, it might not be a big deal, or it might be a big deal depending on who you are and what's going on there. So, especially when you start looking at things like the distributed denial of service attack that was based on there was like a security camera. There's
Mhm.
tens of millions of them around the world. And at some point, somebody realized there was a flaw that was never corrected that allowed them to essentially address them um, globally and create denial of service attacks by running a little tiny bit of code on like a zillion incredibly low powered devices. And that may not sound like a big deal, but it's just one less thing we should not have to deal with in terms of security. Like, it's ridiculous that somebody used a million, security cameras to drop, large websites in a way that was
Yeah.
pretty much undetectable. But you know what I mean? This all kind of adds up. I think, the IoT stuff has always been kind of abysmally maintained, and security's always been an afterthought. So I'm excited. Are these basic? Absolutely. Are they a good place to start? Absolutely.
So let me ask you guys this just before we move on. What do we as an industry do? Because if somebody brings something to us at or during the project or the initial project, that's fairly easy to address. The problem comes when you've walked out the door and you have a service contract or you have a warranty, and a week later somebody brings home something they bought at, Amazon or Target or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, check this cool thing out. I'm gonna throw it on my Wi-Fi." Is there any way to address that, or is there anything we as an industry should be doing to try and protect ourselves from that?
Well, I mean, this is one of those cases, and I have friends who would start laughing hysterically the second I say this, but is this what contracts are for? Is this what
That's where I
defining
was
the
going.
scope of your responsibility is? Do you, if you are responsible for setting up the network in the house as part of the AV integration, or I always think in terms of AV, right? But control
Mhm.
systems are way broader than that. Do you sit down and very clearly define, who is in charge of what network? Does the end user, the consumer, the client get access to stuff like that? It's a really interesting question, especially if it's hardwired. They can just plug an Ethernet jack in and
Yeah.
bypass, unless you've assigned, what I mean, unless you've gone through and very tightly locked down the network. Um, I think you want to have something in place where people understand that whatever they plug into the network is different from whatever you plugged into the network, and that, the responsibilities are separated here.
All right, gentlemen, let's move on to the next story of the day. This comes to us from Residential Tech Today. Speaker placement is location, location, location. Go read through the article. It may seem basic, but it is very intriguing to go through. Again, even if you've done this for years, just because, again, it's a refresher. Patrick, I wanted to start with you on this. How do you deal with this from a principle, right? As far as the proper placement for speakers? We're all in this industry. We know the science behind this, right? We can look at a room and go, okay, here's where things are going to go. How do you go about dealing with clients who are either vastly uninformed about placement and they say, no, I want it over there, versus the clients who are over-informed and can't realize the complications of site conditions or construction or the designer?
Oh man. Yeah, I'm mentally thinking like, the speaker placement, what's the line? The plan doesn't survive first contact with the enemy.
Yes.
Speaker placement doesn't, survive first contact with the living room. I'm in part laughing and in part crying because at one point I'd spent a lot of time dealing with a really weird room, my own living room at the time, and I'd figured out finally a speaker placement that eliminated a bunch of issues. What I didn't do was like measure the exact location of the feet of the speaker stands or temporarily wrap blue tape around them, because when I got back from taking my kids to the park, they were slammed up against the bookshelves. And this is relatively minor, right? But when you're looking at, it's funny, right? I want my speaker here. And a friend of mine who was very upset about how his system sounded. I'm like, well, you shoved your bookshelf speaker with the port in the back of the bookshelf that's smothered, which is creating issues with your bass, and you put it up against this 8-foot wall, and you have a big open area over here. So yes, here's what's happening. All the high frequencies from the tweeter is bouncing against this wall, and everything sounds wrong because you basically turn $8,000 worth of speakers into something that sounds like a car stereo from the early 90s, and not an expensive one. And it's challenging to explain that physics is real and that we are using transducers that we call speakers to convert electrical signals into physical motion that excites the air and brings the sound to our ears. And when you have priorities like, I want furniture in the living room, or I don't want furniture in the living room, or I refuse to have this speaker anywhere up against the wall, if you don't choose your equipment, you end up having really challenging audio issues, some of which can be overcome through lots and lots of fancy, DSP work, and some of which are just, this is what it's going to sound like, right? And it's the flip side of that is I was talking to a friend of mine who's gotten very deeply invested in objective measurements of audio equipment, which for the most part I am a big fan of. I've seen too many promises from too many cable companies that just make me laugh when they don't make me angry. But the thing is, like, it's I was thinking about this amplifier, but it only has a sign in of 110 dB. I'm like, that's 2 orders of magnitude past what any human being's ear can hear. So I think you're okay. And in real world testing, around 60 or 70 dB, most people can't hear the difference. And he was like, but I'm like, yeah. That guy's got a cool tool and he measures stuff, but he's a little obsessed, and he gets really angry about speaker measurements. And then, I'm kind of babbling on here, but it's, when somebody's spent a lot of time and they're investing a lot of money in a home theater and they've been up on the Dolby website, it's like, this is math. And I've said this myself. Dolby speaker placement is math. They optimize it for these locations for these reasons to create this environment. And what people don't realize is that, you can often spread those things out or push those things in and compensate, with room tuning so that you don't necessarily have to have the speaker exactly where Dolby wants it. Is that ideal? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do we live in an ideal world? Absolutely not. So it's challenging. I still, I still laugh, about just dealing with center channels. People hate to put a center. I don't want to put a center channel in. I'm like, okay, you're spending all this money and all this gear, and you're kneecapping yourself by not putting this speaker in the front, that associates the majority of the dialogue with the center of the screen. And they were like, and I ended up bringing one over and setting something up. They're like, oh my God, I can hear everything now. I'm like, well, yeah.
Amazing how that works.
So it's a real trade-off, especially when you start. I can't imagine, Mark, if you're dealing with people in the 5 boroughs, especially at a certain economic strata, I can't imagine some of the conversations you must be having with clients, especially giving, I'm thinking of like pre-war apartments in certain parts of Manhattan or now Brooklyn or Queens, where there's this balance between like, oh, this is 100-year-old plaster that nobody can replace, at least not without spending a small fortune, versus I need to hang a speaker if you want to have anything on the left side of the room. Like, what's that like dealing with?
As I tell all my clients, one of the early discussions we have, I say there's a trade-off between acoustics and aesthetics. What I tend to tell them is the better it looks, the worse it sounds. Right? So you can start with tower speakers in the front of the room. Might be beautiful tower speakers, but to a designer, they're nothing but an eyesore. You can move to bookshelf speakers. They're going to sound better. Then you start going to architectural. Then you start going to invisibles. The invisibles look the best. And they serve a purpose, and we sell a lot of them, especially for distributed audio. But if you're doing a dedicated home theater, you might need something a little different. So it's also the purpose, right? If it's a dedicated theater, it's one thing, which I don't really get many of in Manhattan. Most of it's a multi-purpose living, surround sound system in the living room, and you're dealing with where are the windows, where's the especially these older buildings, where are the beams in the ceiling that I can't get to, or I can't put a speaker there because of the beam, or because this is where the electrician put the lights. I need to line the speaker up with the lights so it looks good. So there's a lot of that trade-off of what looks good versus what sounds good. I would probably say we tend to lean 75% to what looks good, just because that usually we're dealing with these smaller apartments are 3,000-4,000 square feet. Compared to a big 10,000 square foot, Texas house.
This is not the Manhattan I had ever had the pleasure of living in.
I know.
I did walk by it a lot at certain stages of my life.
I don't live it. I just work in it.
Mark, let me ask you this. How do you go about getting into that conversation about essentially the art versus the science of speaker placement without making it a confrontational conversation?
I really ask them, what's more important to you? There will be trade-offs. We make trade-offs every day in life. Is it how attuned are you to good acoustics? Are you a concert pianist? Are you a musician? Do you play guitar? Is this something you care about? Or do you just want background music when you have friends over? And there's very different solutions based on what the need is and what the experience they want to have is. And that's sort of how I go down that path.
That's awesome. All right, let's wrap this up with our last story of the day. This comes to us from CE Pro. Specifi IO inks a licensing deal with Snap One through the data licensing agreement. U.S. integrators will now have access to Snap One's entire portfolio within Specifi's business management software platform. Go read through the article, especially if you're either a Snap One dealer or B, a Specifi IO dealer, because it matters to you the most. But go read through it. It is a very interesting thing to see Specifi continue to grow, especially in North America. Mark, let me start with you on this. Do the vendor relationships make or break the proposal tools across the board?
I think so. If kind of what you're referring to is that vendor in the proposal tool?
Yeah, pretty much.
We use D-Tools Cloud, right? If Snap AV wasn't in D-Tools Cloud, that's probably 50% of what we install between mounts and cabling and racks and things like that. If our 3 or 4 core vendors weren't in a software package, then what's the point of that software package for proposals? Because the whole point is to tie into their systems and update pricing and descriptions and everything automatically for me, and I don't have to spend that time doing that. Otherwise, I might as well, just do a spreadsheet, right? Make a pretty PowerPoint. I mean, it's the whole point is to simplify my life, and my life isn't simple unless the vendors are in there. So that's critical. And I would say, Snap is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. So if you don't have them, then sort of what's the point of your proposal software? At least for the residential dealer in the U.S.
That's a great point. All right, Patrick, wrap this up for us. There are still, I don't want to put a percentage on it, but I think it would be higher than anyone would want to imagine, dealers in the residential space that aren't using, heck, a CRM, let alone a proposal tool. What's going to happen for the industry to fully engage or endorse and start using like proper business software?
The story I always hear over and over again about commercial AV is, it's a roadie that got tired of touring and started a business, right? Especially with live events. And, they wanted to have a family. They were tired of not being able to hold a girlfriend. They missed their kids, whatever it is. I think you just asked a question that could apply to a staggering percentage of small businesses in every industry.
Yes, sir.
I think also at some point, especially my cousin wrote an estimating software package for a welding shop he worked for in high school. Saved the guy $100,000 in the first year. This is like $87, 1987. It was a lot of money. And so it was really easy for that guy to, one, take care of my cousin going into college, and two, that was a pretty huge percentage of his business he suddenly clawed back because his estimates were so much better. And I think in a lot of cases, it has to work. It has to be simple. It has to be laden down with a bunch of charges that irritate you every time you deal with them. I'm thinking in particular of a QuickBooks application I've dealt with over the last few years, and it's gone from a finite payment to a monthly payment to the third interface in 3 years and additional cost to do something that I decided to go to another vendor for a single one-time annual expenditure, and I think one of the challenges I have whenever I'm looking at something like this is, will it actually save me money? And is it going to be a charge that doesn't anger me every time I look at it? If that kind of makes sense, you know what I mean? Because there's just the whole continuing income aspect of so many of the software packages out there in pretty much any, corner of any industry, where it's like, how can we tie them into an indefinite monthly fee going in forever versus, and what can we do that actually makes this software package more functional and more useful for our client? That may be the bitter, cranky old man inside of me, but I think this is obvious, like Mark said, one, if you don't have the vendors you need, it's pointless, and nobody's going to be like, yes, I'm going to eliminate all of the goodwill I've built in with 8 years of working with this distributor so I can use your software, right? So I think there's just a lot of things. I also had a friend who's an accountant who once said, look, 80% of people in small business really just need to take one accounting class or just find an accountant and talk before they start making decisions, right? And I don't know. It's an interesting concept, a little out of my wheelhouse, but I've dealt with the situation in other platforms, and mostly I think they just have to make it obvious that it saves people money or time or energy. In theory, some people love spreadsheets.
I didn't realize how much a proposal software would matter until I started using one. Like for 5 years or so, I was doing this business off of literally my proposals were an Excel spreadsheet that I just PDF'd. So the proposal software made all the difference. But until you do it and you try it, and you're like, oh, wow, I'm not missing things. My pricing is up to date. It looks better. I know when if it's a cloud-based one, I know the client looked at it. I know when they looked at it, how many times they looked at it. I know when to follow up with them. It makes a big difference. And until you try it and you do it, you may not realize the impact it's going to have on your business flow.
I think the biggest thing that people overlook when they start evaluating these, and it doesn't matter if it's CRM or a project management tool, it literally does not matter, but a software tool, the time that you have to invest into setup is key. because out of the gate, they all suck. You got to get them all set up before you'll actually start to realize any time saving or monetary saving. So, all right, let's wrap it there. Thank you both so much for joining us. Patrick, if people want to connect with you, learn more about CTI, where can they do that?
Well, you can always go to cti.com, and I am an occasional participant these days on Twitter. Someday I'll even grow up and find non-X platforms to communicate on, or just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Patrick Norton.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Mark, if people want to connect with you, learn more about Home Theater Advisors, where can they do that?
Best place to learn about Home Theater Advisors is at hometheateradvisors.com. And if you want to connect with me, it's mark@hometheateradvisors.com, or find me at Facebook at Mark Feinberg.
Excellent. Thank you both again for joining us. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me at Matt D. Scott on Twitter or X or most other social platforms. But more importantly, please visit AVNation.tv, where you'll find this show as well as a wide variety of other shows with all the verticals that we cover. When you visit the website, please take a moment to check out our supporters. We are extremely thankful for their support and ask that you check them out as well. Thanks again for watching. That's all the time we have for this episode of ResiWeek,
the network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
This is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.